Hi everybody, my name is Steve Mason, as she said. I'm here to talk about what I would consider to be maybe the edges of connected realities, because there are multiple realities that we're dealing with, and there's a lot of work that's happening in many different spaces right now. Obviously, the thing that people are thinking about mostly is the Internet of Things, but that idea has been around, I think, for a while, and it has had many names in the past. And there's also a lot of interesting things happening in the space of immersive experiences and surround cinema, and just interactive environments in general, public spaces. And really, I think what this is all about is figuring out new and interesting ways of applying technology in such a way that we can create personal or personalized experiences in public spaces. And this has been going on, I think, for quite some time. If we even go back to the 17th century, this is a ceiling fresco done at San Ignacio by Andrea Pozzo. 1693. This is a beautiful anamorphic rendering, where if you stand in just the right spot, you get a personalized experience, where you're transported into the spiritual domain through the use of perspective. And if you think about it, this was actually an application of technology, relatively primitive geometry and trigonometry combined with artful craftsmanship and rendering, but nonetheless, the effect was profound. If we jump into modern times now and we start to think about what's happening with personal technology, starting back in the 90s, obviously, we've had personal information managers and pagers and all this stuff, and now we've arrived at this truly miraculous place where we have this magical rectangle that we can hold in our hands, the modern smartphone. And I think now what we're beginning to see is this expansion and this proliferation of some of the componentry in different combinations to move into our environments in areas where the functions actually make sense, right? It doesn't always make sense to do everything in your pocket or in your hand. Another way to think about this is imagine a gradient that exists between personal technology and environmental technology. And environmental, we have things that are fixtures, they're more permanent, they're public, multiple people interact with them at the same time. Things that are mobile are personal, they're modal, you can put them away, and they're transient. And now there's this interesting space in the middle where we have shared, surplus, or enhanced devices that serve specific roles, and maybe they're temporary fixtures that we use to populate our environments. And there's tons of really interesting things happening on Kickstarter or even just commercialized products where there are different docks and there's robotic things you can put your phone into to do interesting telepresence ideas, and there's even, I guess somebody made a robot dog that your iPhone functions as a brain. So there's a lot of interesting creative ideas, and obviously in the kitchen. I mean, I don't know about you, but my first gen iPad is now a Spotify player and recipe and whatever newscasts thing in my kitchen. So I think a lot of people are doing this. So I think this is an expression, I think, of an overall trend of miniaturization, distribution and saturation, if you will, of contemporary technology and componentry into our environment. And I think if you imagine, the analogy would be like water droplets turning into mist. I consider this to be a process of sublimation, where maybe someday the technology doesn't even stand out so much as these sort of chunky, blocky things that occupy our environments, but are considered more as materials that you use to manufacture things, just in the same way you might with wood or glass or metal. And I think if you look at what's going on, it's not really that hard to see. These are all things that are real except for the watch, but that kind of stuff is probably coming quite soon. I mean, if you think about the amount of power that is contained in each of these devices compared to even 5 or 10 years ago, it is pretty astounding, I think. And I love this idea too. This is actually a concept that's being taken to market. And even if it's not successful, I think this is a really interesting expression of this idea, this desire to modularize and distribute componentry in a way that hasn't been done before. This is obviously for a phone idea where people can upgrade their phone without having to buy a new one necessarily. But if you think about what would happen if these components didn't necessarily have to be a phone or a screen, what if you could just build products out of components, sort of taking the Arduino maker at 3D printer level to the next level. In terms of interaction design, this is something that I've been considering quite a bit as well. I think the vast majority of the technology and online services that we all use today and rely on, for the most part, exist in what I would consider to be principally an abstract space. For instance, I would say that social networks they're abstract relationships. They don't actually exist in physical reality. And we also have narrative domains with blogs and Tumblr and things like this, and topical domains like Wikipedia, where there's information that relates to one another. But again, this is all very abstract. And the frontier that's happening right now, or that we're entering into with the Internet of Things and smart spaces, et cetera, is really starting to think about spatial topologies and proximal topologies. And those two things are very different. Proximal is obviously how close you are to something, but spatial is sort of a special one where it's understanding the environment that you're in rather than necessarily the physical distance that you are from somebody, right? Because those are two different things. But ultimately, this is about bridging the abstract and the physical. And I think what's exciting is to think about enhancing cloud intelligence with access to physical reality as both input and output. Another thing that is interesting to consider is there's a lot of design challenges and consequences that we don't really have to think about right now because all of our technology is mostly personal. What happens when technology is used by multiple people simultaneously? What happens with authentication and fault tolerance and a number of other considerations? So today, this is our hero. Not to, I'm not a fanboy of Apple or anything, but it's a nice photo. This is what we have. This is the culmination, and for most things in our environment right now, even the most cutting edge things, our phone is still our gateway into that technology. It's how we access it, it's how we control it. Even with things like Chromecast, which is a really awesome step in the direction of personalized environments, we're still accessing it with our personal phone. In terms of the input, though, there's some really exciting stuff happening with dimensional imaging. So much has happened since the Kinect came out a few years ago. This is really exciting stuff, and when we think about giving the cloud a much more high fidelity understanding of the physical world, this is, I think, a really exciting space. And something that would have cost, upwards of $250,000 or $300,000, a 3D laser scanner, now can be accomplished with what's basically prosumer technology. This is from Matterport. It's basically 3 connects in a device that you put on a tripod in a room. And if this is where we're at now, imagine, very soon, what does this mean for home telepresence or just telepresence in general to create these real-time dimensional renderings? This is a quote by Eve Bahar, but I feel like it sums up my feelings as well about interfaces. And I think it's really interesting to consider non-screen-based interfaces. And clearly, we've had buttons and switches and dials and levers and pulleys and ropes to control machines for quite some time. But with computer technology, we had to invent all these new metaphors, and we had to take the idea of trash cans and files and things like this. I think that probably one of the most significant and important innovations that Apple introduced with iOS was the cavalier abandonment of the hierarchical file system, because those metaphors were no longer appropriate for that computing context. So it begs the question, what metaphors will be appropriate for physical computing? Clearly, there's a number of very smart people asking this question and repeatedly answering it through experimentation, but I don't know if we've really hit a standard yet or the technology has proliferated enough for us to know the answer to that. In terms of output and general experience of technology, I do feel also that there's a bit of a tendency of people to talk about the Internet of Things with examples of Nest, and now we have smoke detectors and washing machines and all these kind of like Home Depot sort of like utilitarian things. But there's also the experiential, the storytelling, the narrative. Basically what happens when we take those technologies and apply them to storytelling and experience, like television and film. There's a lot of really interesting things happening with immersive rendering and ultra high performance, high resolution rendering. And a lot of that stuff is also going to come in really useful when we get into digital lighting products where we have precision digital lighting fixtures that can just screw in the light bulbs. There's a number of initiatives focused on this as well. And one of the things that I think is really, really interesting, kind of sums all this up, this is a video put out by a company called Oblong in Los Angeles. And what we're seeing here is actually 3 different computers. And so this media is being dragged around across multiple machines. They're different operating systems, different form factors. And this is really, I think, the beginning of an interesting era where, what happens when our home is a computing platform. When instead of downloading an app for your phone, you download an app for your house, or you download an app for your business. And it just takes advantage of whatever sensors or displays or outputs or affordances happen to be there. In any case, that's the end of my talk. Thank you.